Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. I hope each and every one of you had a great Christmas time and going into the new year, you've left last year extremely blessed. I know that I have. I am going to read through Ruth chapter 1 today, but before that, I wanted to jump into just a quick discussion. And obviously, you can't answer me on the other side of the screen, but these are things that I want you to think about through the new year. A lot of times we make what we call New Year's resolutions. I myself might want to lose a little bit of this dad bod. So I might want to go to the gym or cut back on soda or even just eat healthier. Now, these are things and New Year's resolutions that I didn't make because I know that I'm going to break them. And if you're like me, you make a lot of resolutions and end up breaking them as well. And I think that's because we make these resolutions and we want to stick with them, but we haven't built the disciplines and the habits necessary to go ahead and follow through with these New Year's resolutions. And the same thing applies to our spiritual walk at times. We want to be a godlier person. We want to have a close relationship with God, and we want to choose the right things. And then when we look back and we have these desires, we end up doing the wrong things sometimes, and we end up having the wrong mentality and the wrong heart. And it's a lot harder because we don't have those disciplines already instilled in us. But I want to set some context to Ruth as we jump in. So, if you're familiar with the story, you know Elimelech and you know Naomi. They were two people in the time of Judges, because Ruth was written in the time of Judges. And if you know anything about the time of Judges, it was one of those times where everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So it was evil times, and people did whatever they wanted to do to satisfy their flesh. I'm sure that can sound a little familiar today, and if you think about it, that's probably the culture that we live in, something similar to that. But during these times, there were still a few people that honored and followed God, and two of those being Elimelech and Naomi. Elimelech meaning God is my king, and Naomi meaning, I think it means pleasant. I have to look at that again. I don't have it right in front of me. Actually, I do. So let's flip over here, and maybe I can look at it for you here. So, yes, Naomi meaning pleasant. But while we're already in here, we can set a little context here. So, Elimelech and Naomi, they give birth to two sons. They have Mahlon and Chilion. So Mahlon and Chilion mean sick and tired. I don't know the reference here, how it applies, but we don't know much about them, but the names, they have some type of meaning there. So we know that Elimelech and Naomi followed God. They were close to God, and they had two sons. And what happened was there was a famine in the land. So Elimelech and Naomi had to make a decision. There was word on the street that over in Moab there was enough to get them by, as they were pretty bad off in Bethlehem. But it had to be pretty bad. That famine had to be pretty bad for them to want to relocate from Bethlehem over to Moab. Because if you don't know anything about the Moabites, we can get into that a little bit. They were a heritage of generational incest. So there was a lot of sin, and there was a lot of tainted history within there over in Moab. And we can trace Moabites back to Lot and his oldest daughter. So Lot and his oldest daughter ended up beginning that generation by sleeping together. And the Moabites were people that worshipped a god named Chemosh. And Chemosh was known through some rituals and some dedication of God of war and a battle and victory. But they offered children as a sacrifice in hopes that they would be blessed in warfare. And so there was oppression between the Moabites and then also over in Bethlehem against the Israelites, which I think were called Ephrathites back then. I'm sure I'm or I'm not butchering that word over there. I did not mean to do that. Let's go back here. I meant to switch over from here. Oh, technical difficulties. What can you do? But I want to talk about something which we can see in Ruth about bold loyalty. So let's read through this passage a little bit now that I've set the stage for you. In these days, when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, not to be confused with Oprah, and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So now, setting the stage here, we see not only did they leave the land of Bethlehem to go to Moab, but their 2 sons, well, Elimelech dies, then we see Mahlon die, and Chilion die. So now we're left with 3 individuals here. We have Naomi, we have Ruth, and we have Orpah. And the names there, I just left them there for translation purposes, the Hebrew names and what the meanings of them are. But Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah are all alone now, without any husbands, without any children. So Naomi is the mother-in-law, Ruth and Orpah are the daughter-in-laws. Now, back in these times, when you had women that were widowed and they had no sons, they had no husbands, they were really susceptible to poverty. So they lived in harder times. And at this point in time, I think there was word that back in Bethlehem, things were getting a little better, and Moab was still going well. But Naomi is bitter at this point in time. She's sad. She's just lost all the men in her life, and she's discouraged. And this next part will kind of explain a little bit more of the story. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of the people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So now we see all 3 of them headed back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." So she's encouraging them at this point in time, hey, go back to the land of your mothers, to where you came from, to marry over there. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people," because they loved Naomi. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" Let's think about this one. She's using logic here. "Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to 2 sons, would you wait for me? Even if I had a husband tonight." Oh, wait. "Would you wait until they grew up?" Sorry. Small wording in this Bible. "Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand is turned against me." So we can see already at a point in this passage that she is very discouraged. She's very bitter. She feels like God has turned his back on her, and she did not want to drag Ruth and Orpah down with her. So as they wept aloud again, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. So now we see that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and then went on her way, and Ruth is trying to stay back with Naomi still. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." And obviously Ruth did not. Verse 16, "But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me,'" and this is a very popular passage. People use it at weddings all the time, but here's the context. "But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me be ever so severely, even if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" And now we see a return pattern here with Naomi's life at this point in time. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So reading through that passage is eye-opening for myself, seeing this situation and seeing the history here. And the history here and the heritage and the difference between Israel and the Israelites and the Moabites, and just seeing how God still chooses to work in the most weird circumstances. Something that you wouldn't think. It's like unnatural. You expect if a Savior's to be born in Bethlehem and the Jews are God's people, that all of the heritage of Jesus would come from the Jewish side. But this is the beginning of something very interesting. This is the beginning of a story that, looking on the outside, wouldn't make sense. We have a Gentile nation in the Moabites who were very wicked and evil. And then we have the Israelites where some were still honoring God and following God. But yet, Ruth's choices allowed her to be part of something bigger in God's plan. Not to say that, Orpah on the other side, let's be honest, put yourself in that situation in those times in the historical context. Orpah had a better shot, and so did Ruth, at going back to the land that they knew of. I'm sure they were still young enough to get married and find men to take care of them. And in Bethlehem, the Israelites did not look favorably upon wedding outside a Gentile or even a Moabite because of that oppression. So Ruth's potential of going back to the land of Bethlehem was counterintuitive to what made sense during those times. And to look at this a little bit further, so we can see now that Elimelech's gone, Mahlon's gone, Kilion's gone, Orpah goes the other direction out. So now it's just Naomi and Ruth. And here's a picture by William Blake. It's a really cool illustration. But this right here just shows like Naomi. And I think from the picture you can kind of see she's depressed, she's afflicted. She feels like maybe God is against her. And we see Orpah walking the other direction. And then here we see Ruth clinging on. And that's a great picture of clinging. So now we have Naomi, and Naomi goes to Bethlehem, and people recognize her, and they say, "Can this be Naomi?" So obviously they had a name in the town of Bethlehem. It was small enough, or they made an impression to some of the people, and when Naomi got back, they recognized her. But Naomi went away from her identity a little bit and lived in her bitterness. She said, "Hey, listen, God has gone away from me." And we can see there, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." This goes parallel very well with some of the Psalms. I keyed some of those on the bottom of the screen. Feel free to read those in your time. But Psalm 13 is one that stuck to me. "How long will you turn your face from me, O Lord? Forever." David is at a time also afflicted, and he feels like his enemies have the upper hand on him. And he comes back to say and to voice his opinions and to voice his frustration to God, who is willing to listen, even through his bigger plans. But David shifted in a different way that Naomi did at this point in time. David went from his frustration to crying out to God to prayer and then after that to praise. So we see his problem, his prayer, and then praise through the Psalm 13. It's a very short psalm, but you can read through it and look at that transition, a heart transition. And I think we see the same thing with Naomi. But in this moment, we see that Naomi's bitter and she's forgotten. She's forgotten her relationship with Ruth and her daughter-in-laws, and she's forgotten that God has been faithful. Even through the loss, God has been faithful to her. But Naomi's changed her name to Mara because she feels bitter. But the challenge is here, we don't lose sight of God's faithfulness in the midst of your own pain and bitterness. This is a hard pill to swallow at this point in time because we can relate to Naomi in the sense of, if you have ever had something terrible happen to you, and we hear this question all the time, how in God's sovereignty can bad things happen? But that's the problem. When we get to that point, we look at circumstances, we look at sin, we look at everything going on in the world, we get to a point of where we can put ourselves in the hot seat to question God. And that's normal. That's human emotion. We can't understand the mind of God. And sometimes we never see the bigger picture. Sometimes there's things that we can't tackle mentally to understand what the bigger plan is. But the challenge here is not to lose sight of God's faithfulness. I mean, he's been faithful to Naomi. He brought Naomi, and it's weird that she phrases it this way in my mind. I left full and came back empty. There was a famine in the land when she left Bethlehem. She didn't leave full, and she came back where Bethlehem was starting to turn it around. There was no longer a famine. So if you really think about it in context, she left full, or she left empty and came back full. But she's talking more so about her spiritual emotions. So her connection with God. She felt distant from God because of the loss that she had experienced. It was about her circumstance, not about God's providence. And you know, we can see that parallel in different chapters of the Bible or different Bible characters. In Job, we can see that. Job was heavily afflicted, and yet he still may have questioned God, but he remained faithful to God, and God blessed him in ways that we can't understand as well. But the plan, obviously, we can see, retrospective, we can see God's plan was to show that his people were still worth saving. When Job was able to stand up in the middle of a sinful world, people like Noah were able to believe and trust God in a world that nobody followed God and everybody doubted truth. Sound familiar? Sound familiar in this culture that we're in? The challenge is not to lose sight of God's faithfulness even in the midst of our own pain and bitterness. But even further than that, there's another thing that I want us to see. A fresh start comes from continued faithfulness and bold loyalty. See, we talked about New Year's resolutions, and we talked about making adjustments in our own lives, but we look at that as a fresh start. But a fresh start really comes daily. It comes from a continued faithfulness and a bold loyalty. And who better to describe that than Ruth? Given her situation, she could have walked away like Orpah and started fresh in the sense of remarrying, being with her people, worshiping pagan gods. But she chose to follow Naomi, to worship the one true God, and to put her trust in God for her providence. And we'll see that a little further as we study Ruth. But those are things that I want us to put at. So Naomi's fresh start was really a continued obedience and faithfulness and a bold loyalty to say, you know what? I don't care if it's going to be easier in Moab. I trust that God will provide, and I don't want to leave you alone broken. I want to share that brokenness with you. There's a community and there's a beauty in that, in the sense that she sacrificed her own well-being to be with Naomi, her mother-in-law. Not even her mother, her mother-in-law, which shows you that connection and friendliness and just that relationship between them. It's a beautiful thing. So as we go from the troubles and trials in our lives, I want to leave us with one reminder before we jump into the rest of Ruth later on, because we're only focused on Ruth chapter 1 today. The final focus comes from Corrie ten Boom, or the final thought. No matter how deep our darkness, he is deeper still. If you don't know a lot about Corrie ten Boom, I challenge you to look her up, maybe Google her to find out a little bit more about her story. But she would help hide, during the Holocaust, Jews away from the Nazis. And she's responsible for saving hundreds of Jews. But she was ratted out by one of her neighbors in her culture or community. And she was put in a prison camp, and then she was able to survive later on. But this was one of the thoughts that she coined that stuck with me through all of this. No matter how deep our darkness, he is deeper still. Look at Naomi's life. She had lost the closest people in her life to her husband, her companion. She lost her lineage and her heritage in both of her sons. And she was left with two daughter-in-laws, which during that time wouldn't have brought too much for the family name. Would have had to given up everything and live in poverty, or hope that somebody would take her in. And these are challenging things. And during that darkness, God was still deeper than all of that. So remember that as you go throughout those hard times. And I know that it can be difficult to shift that mind and to have this same heart going through it. But when dark times come and you feel so deep away from God's love, just know that his love is deeper than those dark times. I hope you enjoyed this message. It's something that I will continue on through chapter 2, 3, and 4. So stay tuned, and there's definitely more to come from this story. But this is a great takeaway, and it's something that I'm going to take away with me in my own life. No matter how dark the times, no matter how deep that darkness feels, I know that my God is deeper, and I know that my God has already made a way. Thank you so much. Have a great day.